The locomotive wheezed like an old man climbing stairs, black smoke belching from its stack in irregular puffs that painted the azure New Mexico sky with sooty clouds. Jake Morrison wiped his grease-stained hands on his leather chaps, squinting at the massive iron beast that had decided to die precisely when the Atchison and Santa Fe needed it most. The year was 1887, and progress waited for no man, especially not a widowed cowboy turned reluctant railroad mechanic. "Papa, is the train gonna explode?" 8-year-old Tommy Morrison peered from behind a stack of railroad ties, his freckled face a mirror of concern and fascination. The boy had inherited his mother's curious green eyes and Jake's stubborn jaw, a combination that spelled trouble in any territory. "Not if I can help it, son." Jake's voice carried the weight of responsibility that had settled on his shoulders 3 years ago when consumption claimed his beloved Sarah. Since then, it had been just him and Tommy against a world that seemed determined to test every ounce of their resilience. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Jake's attention from the locomotive's innards. A magnificent black stallion thundered toward the depot, its rider sitting with the poise of European nobility despite the dust and heat of the American frontier. As the horse slowed, Jake caught his first glimpse of the woman who would turn his carefully ordered world upside down. Baroness Isabella von Habsburg dismounted with fluid grace, her riding habit a deep burgundy that somehow remained pristine despite the journey. Her auburn hair was pinned in an elaborate style that spoke of wealth and refinement, yet her eyes, the color of storm clouds, held a fire that no finishing school could have taught her. "Are you the mechanic?" Her accent carried traces of Austrian aristocracy, mixed with something indefinably American, as if she'd spent years learning to belong in this wild land. Jake straightened, suddenly aware of his disheveled appearance. "Jake Morrison, ma'am. And you'd be?" "Baroness Isabella von Habsburg, though most folks around here just call me Belle." She extended a gloved hand, and when Jake hesitated, she raised an eyebrow. "I don't bite, Mr. Morrison. Usually." The handshake lasted a moment longer than propriety demanded, and Jake felt something electric pass between them, a recognition that transcended social boundaries and spoke to something deeper. "What brings European nobility to our humble depot?" Jake asked, releasing her hand reluctantly. Belle's laugh was like silver bells in a summer breeze. "Business, Mr. Morrison. I own a considerable stake in this railroad, and when my trains don't run on time, I lose money. Lots of money." Tommy emerged from his hiding spot, drawn by curiosity and the musical quality of Belle's voice. "Are you a real baroness, like in the fairy tales?" Belle knelt to Tommy's eye level, her expression softening. "I suppose I am, though I'm afraid I left my tiara back in Austria. What's your name, young sir?" "Tommy Morrison. That's my papa." The boy pointed proudly at Jake. "He can fix anything even when it's really, really broken." "Is that so?" Belle stood, fixing Jake with an appraising look that made his pulse quicken. "Because this locomotive has been giving us trouble for weeks. 3 different mechanics have declared it beyond repair." Jake felt his professional pride stir. "Well, they weren't Jake Morrison. Confident, aren't we?" Belle's smile held a challenge that Jake found irresistible. "What if I told you that getting this train running by sunset would save my company, and this entire town, from financial ruin?" The weight of her words settled over the depot like a heavy blanket. Jake had heard rumors of the railroad's financial troubles, whispers that the line might be abandoned, leaving their small community to wither and die. "And if I can't?" Jake asked, though he was already mentally cataloging the tools he'd need. Belle stepped closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something exotic and intoxicating that reminded him of distant places and impossible dreams. "Then I suppose we'll all have to find new ways to make a living." She paused, her eyes dancing with mischief. "But if you do manage this miracle, Mr. Morrison," she let the words hang in the air like smoke from the dying locomotive. "Yes? Well, let's just say I'm a woman who pays her debts generously." As Belle walked away, her hips swaying with unconscious grace, Jake realized that his quiet life had just become infinitely more complicated. Tommy tugged at his sleeve. "Papa, I think the pretty lady likes you." Jake watched Belle disappear into the depot office, his heart hammering against his ribs like a prisoner demanding freedom. "Son, I think you might be right, and that scares me more than any broken locomotive ever could." Chapter 2. Sparks and Secrets. The sun climbed higher, turning the railroad yard into a furnace that would have made Hades himself sweat. Jake had stripped down to his undershirt, his muscled torso glistening as he worked with the focused intensity of a man whose reputation hung in the balance. Every bolt, every valve, every inch of copper tubing received his complete attention. Belle found herself watching from the depot office window more often than she cared to admit. There was something mesmerizing about the way Jake moved. Economical, purposeful, like a dancer who knew every step by heart. She'd known many men in her 32 years, from Viennese counts to New York industrialists, but none had possessed this combination of raw masculinity and gentle tenderness she'd witnessed when he spoke to his son. "Mama used to say Papa could fix a broken heart with the right tools," Tommy announced, appearing beside Belle at the window, with the sudden materialization that only children seem to master. Belle startled, then smiled. "Your mama sounds like she was a wise woman. She was the prettiest lady in 3 counties, Papa says, but she got sick and went to heaven." Tommy's matter-of-fact delivery couldn't quite hide the lingering sadness in his young voice. Belle's heart clenched. She knelt beside the boy, her expensive skirts forgotten. "I'm sure she was beautiful, Tommy, and I bet she's very proud of you and your papa." "Do you think Papa's handsome?" The question was delivered with the devastating directness that only children possessed. Belle glanced back at Jake, who was now completely absorbed in the locomotive's mechanical mysteries, his strong hands coaxing life from dead metal. "I think your papa is a very capable man." Tommy grinned. "That means yes in grown-up talk, doesn't it?" Before Belle could formulate a response that wouldn't encourage the boy's obvious matchmaking schemes, a commotion erupted outside. 3 men on horseback had ridden into the yard, their faces hard, and their intentions clearly unfriendly. The leader, a scarred man with dead eyes, dismounted and approached Jake. "Morrison, you're coming with us." Jake straightened slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward the Colt 45 at his hip. "Blackwood, thought you were still enjoying the hospitality of Yuma Territorial Prison. Got out early for good behavior," Blackwood sneered. "Funny thing about prison, gives a man time to think, time to remember old debts." Belle felt ice form in her veins despite the desert heat. She'd heard whispers about Jake's past, rumors that he'd once ridden with questionable company before settling down with his wife. Now it seemed that past had come calling. "Tommy, go to the back office. Now." Jake's voice carried absolute authority, and the boy obeyed without question. "Smart boy," Blackwood observed. "Wouldn't want him to see what happens next." "My business is with you, Blackwood. Leave the boy out of it." "Your business?" Blackwood laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You cost me 5 years of my life, Morrison. 5 years in that hellhole because you decided to grow a conscience." Belle's mind raced. Whatever Jake had done, it had clearly saved lives, probably including her own, given Blackwood's reputation for violence. She made a decision that would have horrified her Austrian relatives, but felt absolutely right in this moment. Stepping onto the depot platform, Belle called out in her most imperious voice, "Gentlemen, I do hope you're not planning to interfere with my railroad's operations." Blackwood turned, his eyes widening as he took in Bell's obvious wealth and authority. "This ain't your concern, lady. On the contrary, Mr. Morrison is in my employ, and this locomotive must be operational by sunset. Any delays will cost my company thousands of dollars." Bell descended the steps with regal composure, every inch the European aristocrat. "I trust you understand the legal implications of interfering with interstate commerce." The bluff was audacious, but Bell had learned that confidence could be more powerful than any weapon. Blackwood hesitated, clearly calculating the risks of tangling with someone who obviously had connections and resources. Jake seized the moment. "You heard the lady, Blackwood. I've got work to do." "This ain't over, Morrison," Blackwood snarled, but he was already backing toward his horse. "We'll be around." As the three men rode away, Belle felt her knees go weak with relief. Jake was beside her in an instant, his strong hand steadying her. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Probably both," Belle admitted, acutely aware of his proximity, the warmth radiating from his body, the way his eyes seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Why?" Jake asked. "Why risk yourself for a stranger?" Belle looked up into his face, seeing past the grease and sweat to the good man beneath. "Because, Mr. Morrison, I don't think you're a stranger at all. I think you're exactly what this town, what I, have been waiting for." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and promise, until Tommy's voice broke the spell. "Papa, the train's making funny noises again." Jake reluctantly released Belle, but not before she saw something kindle in his eyes, something that made her pulse race and her carefully ordered world tilt on its axis. Chapter 3. Revelations and Redemption. The locomotive's death rattle echoed across the desert as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Jake's hands were raw from wrestling with stubborn machinery, his back ached from hours bent over the engine, and his heart hammered with the growing certainty that he was about to fail the most important woman he'd met since Sarah. Belle paced the platform like a caged lioness, her earlier composure cracking with each labored wheeze from the dying engine. The financial report spread across her makeshift desk told a story she'd been trying to ignore for months. The railroad was hemorrhaging money, and this locomotive represented their last hope of meeting the crucial shipping contract that would save everything. "Papa, maybe you should take a break," Tommy suggested, offering his father a cup of water with the solemn concern of a child who'd learned too young that adults weren't invincible. Jake accepted the water gratefully, his eyes finding Belle across the yard. She stood silhouetted against the setting sun, and for a moment, he saw not the confident Baroness, but a woman carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. "Tommy, stay here," Jake said, walking toward Belle with the determined stride of a man who'd made a decision. Belle turned as he approached, and Jake saw the fear she'd been hiding behind her aristocratic mask. "How bad is it?" she asked quietly. "Bad," Jake admitted. "The boiler's cracked, the drive rods are warped, and the firebox is shot to hell. Pardon my language." Belle's shoulders sagged. "So it's over." "Maybe not." Jake reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a folded telegram, yellowed with age. "I sent this 3 years ago, right after Sarah died. Never got a reply." Belle took the telegram with trembling fingers, her eyes widening as she read. "To Baron Friedrich von Habsburg, Vienna, your daughter Isabella, safe, stop married. Good man, stop living quietly, New Mexico. Stop, please forgive her, stop, she loves you, stop. J. Morrison." The paper fluttered from Belle's nerveless fingers. You knew?" "I suspected from the moment you said your name. Isabella von Habsburg. The Baron's daughter who scandalized Vienna by running off with an American fortune hunter, only to disappear completely when he abandoned her in San Francisco. Jake's voice was gentle, understanding. You've been hiding here for 5 years, building a new life, a new identity. Tears streamed down Belle's face, washing away years of carefully constructed lies. How long have you known? Since yesterday when I saw you handle that horse. Sarah used to say you could tell everything about a person by how they treated animals. You rode like someone who'd been trained in European courts, but you cared for that stallion like he was family. Belle laughed through her tears, a sound caught between joy and despair. I thought I'd fooled everyone. The railroad investment, the business connections, it's all built on lies, Jake. I'm not a baroness anymore. I'm just a woman who made terrible choices and has been running from them ever since. Jake stepped closer, his calloused hands framing her face with infinite tenderness. Isabella, you're the strongest woman I've ever met. You took nothing and built an empire. You saved this town, gave people hope and jobs. That's not running. That's fighting. But the locomotive will run, Jake said with quiet conviction, because I know where to get the parts we need. Belle's eyes widened. Where? Jake's smile was rueful. From the train that Blackwood and I robbed 6 years ago. The one that's been rusting in Devil's Canyon ever since. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they could cross. Belle searched Jake's face, seeing the shame and regret he'd carried for years. You were an outlaw, she said quietly. For 2 years, after my first wife died in childbirth and I lost everything, I was angry, stupid, and desperate. Jake's voice was steady, unflinching. Sarah changed all that. She saw something in me worth saving, just like you're doing now. Belle's hands covered his, her touch electric. What happened with Blackwood? The job went wrong. Innocent people were going to die, including a woman with a baby. I couldn't let that happen, so I turned on my own gang, helped the sheriff capture them. Jake's eyes never left hers. Cost me everything I thought I wanted, but it gave me everything I actually needed, a chance to be the man Sarah believed I could be. And now I'm asking you to trust me one more time. Help me get to that canyon and I'll have this locomotive running by midnight. But Belle, Jake's voice grew serious. If we do this, there's no going back. Blackwood will know where those parts came from and he'll come for us both. Belle stood on her tiptoes, her lips brushing Jake's in a kiss that tasted of hope and desperation and the promise of tomorrow. Then we'd better make sure we're ready for him. As they broke apart, Tommy's voice rang across the yard. Papa, there's a whole bunch of riders coming this way. Jake and Belle turned to see dust clouds on the horizon, too many for Blackwood's small gang. As the riders drew closer, Belle gasped in recognition. Federal marshals, she breathed. Someone's been asking questions about the railroad's finances. Jake's jaw tightened. Looks like we're about to find out just how much trouble we're really in. Chapter 4. Love, Locomotives, and Last Chances. The federal marshals rode into the depot yard like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, their badges glinting in the dying sunlight. Marshal William Hayes, a weathered man with steel-gray eyes, dismounted with the deliberate movements of someone accustomed to delivering bad news. Baroness von Habsburg, Hayes said, touching his hat brim. Or should I say, Miss Isabella Hoffman of San Francisco. Belle's carefully constructed world crumbled in that single sentence. Jake stepped protectively beside her, his hand resting on his gun, while Tommy peered out from behind the locomotive with wide, frightened eyes. Marshal Hayes, Belle said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. I assume you're here about the railroad's financial irregularities. Among other things, Hayes produced a sheaf of papers. Fraud, embezzlement, operating under false pretenses. The list is quite extensive. Jake's mind raced. Everything Belle had built, everything she'd worked for was about to be destroyed by the very past she'd been running from. But as he looked at her, chin raised, shoulders squared, facing ruin with the dignity of true nobility, he realized something that changed everything. "Marshal," Jake interrupted, "before you arrest anyone, you might want to know that Miss Hoffman has been operating under my direct supervision for the past 3 years. Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Your supervision, Mr. Morrison?" "That's right." Jake's voice carried the conviction of a man who'd found his purpose. As a federal railroad inspector, working undercover to investigate irregularities in the territorial rail system. Belle's sharp intake of breath was barely audible, but Jake felt her hand find his, squeezing tight. He was improvising wildly, but sometimes the biggest lies contained the most important truths. "I have no record of any federal inspector named Morrison," Hayes said suspiciously, "because my real name is Jacob Morgenstein, and my credentials are sealed under direct orders from Washington." Jake reached into his vest, praying that the old letter he'd carried for years would serve one final purpose. This should explain everything. The letter was actually a commendation from the territorial governor, thanking Jake for his help in capturing Blackwood's gang. But in the fading light, with official seals and impressive letterhead, it looked convincing enough to give Hayes pause. As the marshal examined the document, Belle whispered, "Jake, what are you doing?" "Saving the woman I love," he replied quietly, the words carrying the weight of absolute truth. Hayes looked up from the letter, his expression thoughtful. "This is highly irregular, Inspector Morgenstein." "The entire situation is irregular, Marshal. Miss Hoffman was recruited specifically because her background allowed her to move in circles where a regular federal agent would be noticed. Her criminal activities were all part of an elaborate sting operation to expose corruption in the territorial railroad system." It was a magnificent bluff, built on half-truths and desperate hope. But as Jake spoke, he realized he was describing exactly what Belle had actually accomplished. She had exposed corruption, saved jobs, and brought prosperity to a dying town. "And the locomotive?" Hayes asked. "The final piece of evidence. Once it's operational, it will complete a shipping route that will expose the real criminals, the ones who've been sabotaging rail service to drive down property values for their own profit." Hayes studied them both for a long moment. In the distance, thunder rumbled, and Jake realized it wasn't a storm approaching. It was the sound of many horses moving fast. "Blackwood," Belle breathed. The outlaw and his expanded gang crested the hill like a dark wave, at least 20 riders strong. They'd obviously spent the day recruiting every desperado and malcontent within 50 miles. "Well," Hayes said dryly, "this should be interesting." Blackwood reined in his horse just outside rifle range, his voice carrying across the yard. "Morrison, time to settle accounts." Jake stepped forward, his hand steady on his gun. "Tommy, get inside the depot. Belle, stay behind the locomotive." "Like hell," Belle said, producing a small but deadly derringer from her skirts. "I didn't survive 5 years in the wilderness to hide now." Hayes signaled his men, who spread out in defensive positions. "Mr. Morrison, or Morgenstein, I suggest you explain the situation quickly." "Blackwood's the real criminal you're after," Jake said. "He's been sabotaging rail lines across 3 territories, stealing shipments and murdering anyone who gets in his way." "Prove it," Hayes demanded. Jake's smile was grim. "I intend to." He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "Blackwood, you want me? Come and take me. But first, tell the marshal here about the gold shipment you stole from the Denver and Rio Grande last month." Blackwood's laugh echoed across the desert. "You always were too smart for your own good, Morrison. Yeah, I took that gold, and I'll take a lot more before I'm done." Hayes's expression hardened. That's a federal crime, Mr. Blackwood. Catch me if you can, Marshal. The battle erupted in a thunder of gunfire and shouting men. Jake dove behind the locomotive as bullets whined overhead, pulling Bell down beside him. The marshals returned fire with disciplined volleys while Blackwood's gang charged in a wild, undisciplined rush. "The boiler!" Bell shouted over the gunfire. "If a bullet hits the cracked boiler, the whole thing will explode," Jake finished, taking half the depot with it. In that moment, Jake saw their only chance. Racing to the locomotive's cab, he began the startup sequence he'd memorized over years of railroad work. The engine wheezed, coughed, and then, miracle of miracles, began to build steam. "Belle, can you handle the throttle?" "I can handle anything," she shouted back, scrambling into the cab. "Then let's show these boys how the West was really won." Jake released the brakes as Belle opened the throttle. The locomotive lurched forward with a shriek of protesting metal, steam billowing from every joint. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't smooth, but it was moving. Blackwood's gang scattered as the iron monster bore down on them, but their leader stood his ground, raising his rifle for one final shot at Jake. The bullet never came. Tommy Morrison, all of 8 years old and armed with nothing but a railroad lantern, had crept up behind Blackwood and brought the heavy lamp down on the outlaw's head with all the strength his small body could muster. As Blackwood crumpled, the remaining gang members threw down their weapons. The battle was over. Later, as the marshals led the prisoners away and the locomotive cooled in the desert night, Jake found Belle sitting on the depot platform, staring up at the stars. "So," she said as he settled beside her, "Inspector Morgenstein?" Jake laughed. "I figured if you could be a baroness, I could be a federal agent." The marshal didn't believe a word of it, you know. No, but he believed in us. Sometimes that's enough. Belle leaned against his shoulder, and Jake marveled at how perfectly she fit there. "What happens now?" "Now we fix that locomotive properly, run this railroad the right way, and see if a former outlaw and a runaway baroness can build something real together." "And Tommy?" Jake smiled, watching his son demonstrate proper lantern-swinging technique to a group of fascinated deputies. "I think Tommy's going to be just fine. He's got his mother's courage and his father's stubborn streak. Plus, he seems to approve of you." Belle turned in his arms, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "Jake Morrison, are you proposing to me?" "Isabella Hoffman," Jake replied, using her real name with infinite tenderness. "I'm asking if you'd like to find out what happens when two people stop running from their past and start building their future." Her kiss was answer enough. 6 months later, the Atchison and Santa Fe's most reliable locomotive pulled into the depot right on schedule, its whistle echoing across the New Mexico desert. The brass nameplate on its side read, "The Isabella," and everyone in 3 counties knew the story of how love, determination, and one very brave little boy had saved not just a railroad, but an entire town. And if sometimes late at night you could hear laughter coming from the depot office where the former baroness and the reformed outlaw worked side by side, planning routes and dreaming dreams, well, that was just the sound of the West being won, one heart at a time.